Hello, I am Maria Dasli, and I have been asked by the editors of Discourse Studies in the Cultural Politics of Education to talk about my paper, Intercultural Education of Tolerance and Hospitality. In recent years, there has been a significant growth of interest in cultural diversity within the context of schools and classrooms. Leading supranational bodies, such as UNESCO and the Council of Europe, have become more responsive to the needs of culturally diverse pupils, and in so doing, they have produced a rich range of standard-setting policy documents that together present an intercultural approach to education. Now, while this approach is notoriously difficult to explain, partly because of the lack of any unity in the definition of the term intercultural, a closer look at these documents reveals that intercultural education draws heavily on the notion of tolerance to promote peaceful coexistence. At the same time, relevant research has suggested that tolerance may not be the best possible approach to accommodating cultural difference, and that the assumption about a naturalized link between tolerance and peaceful coexistence might well be problematic. Regrettably, however, this suggestion has not attracted the interest of policymakers to date, and this is why I wrote this paper. So with this in mind, my aim in this paper was to focus on the nature and limits of tolerance. To do so, I drew on contemporary theorisations of the notion to suggest that while tolerance appears fundamental for peaceful coexistence, it has several caveats. In my paper, I discussed the caveats extensively and pointed out three things. The first is that there exist controversial instances of intolerable behavior which no rational society can fully condemn or criminalize. The second is that free speech can inflict psychological distress on those who have not as yet learned to live with disagreement, because the function of much argumentation is to convince others of the acceptability of what one says. And the third and final point I made relates to the ideal of individual autonomy, which places too much of an emphasis on the pursuit of one's own goals and objectives, thereby neglecting to consider the importance that social relationships and dependency have for human life. In the light of this argumentation, I propose that the ethics of hospitality, as elaborated by Derrida and Dufourmantelle, may provide a more viable approach to accommodating cultural difference. To explain why, I drew on the two contradictory yet indissociable orders of hospitality which the philosophers identify in their work. The first order of hospitality, which they call absolute or pure hospitality, welcomes whomever or whatever arrives unconditionally, in that it entails an ethical relation of responsibility for the other that precedes and exceeds the freedom of the host. In this sense, the host accepts the possibility of every sacrifice, thereby becoming not only host but also hostage of the other. By contrast, the second order of hospitality, which Derrida and Dufourmantelle identify, is called conditional hospitality. Conditional hospitality posits a limit to what one can offer or do, both on the personal level and on the level of the state, in that it demands that the host keeps guests under control, precisely because in this way he or she can avoid becoming hostage of the other. But while the two orders of hospitality are contradictory to each other and make hospitality impossible, impossibility, as I have argued in the paper after Derrida, is not meaningless. It is not meaningless because it sustains hospitality's undecidable nature and helps one to understand that acts of conditional hospitality take place in the shadow of the ideal version, which is absolute hospitality. To finish off now with the implications for intercultural education, it is worth reminding that this paper placed the ethical relation of responsibility for the other at the center of the host-guest encounter. But rather than insisting on the view of a conscious and intentionally respectful relationship among people, as is arguably the case in most intercultural education scholarship, I argued that responsibility is issued neither from universal consciousness nor from a will of one's own. Otherwise, both self and other would be placed on one continuum of cultural values that would ultimately abolish the radical alterity of both. Several education philosophers have made a similar point when questioning the idea of the knowing ego as the locus of all responsibility, and together they call intercultural educators to abandon some of the most trusted principles of intercultural education theory and practice. And there may be many reasons that have encouraged education philosophers to make this call. It may be that intercultural education suffers from a number of theoretical weaknesses, or it may be that educational theory and practice is grounded upon the problematic discourse of modernity in which the other is acknowledged only in order to be possessed. Recent intercultural research has indeed shown that the majority of related courses and programs resonate sympathetically with an unstated movement towards wholeness, which rather than preserving the radical otherness of the other, resolves all difference in favor of moral absolutism. Consequently, if our aim is to design courses that do not diminish alterity in the name of some kind of higher order truth, it may be worth acknowledging that there is not just one morality and that moralities exist only within the world of possible lived experience. Most importantly, as I have argued in the paper, the courses we ought to design must remain radically open to different alternatives. Saying therefore that we already know what a good intercultural pedagogy should look like, not only leads to the suppression of the other, but also cancels the task of infinite analysis, which each one of us has to undertake as part of a necessarily reflective pedagogic practice. The ethics of hospitality, as I have argued in the paper, play an important role in this practice, because in addition to enabling a critical rethinking of the ideals of individual autonomy and critical reason, they interrogate the normative goals carried in the educational language of modernity. Education philosophers have shown how these goals can be interrogated. However, with the current policy emphasis on tolerance as precondition of the ethical, their perspectives have been ignored. By providing a combined theorization of tolerance and hospitality in this paper, I hope to have given educators good enough reasons for the adoption of open alternatives and to have helped them see that the radical ethical basis for peace and dialogue is not tolerance, but hospitality. Thank you.